Thank you to everybody who's joining us today. And a particular thanks, of course, to Tyler Calder, who's joining us from Canada. Tyler has an impressive track record in innovation. He's currently Chief Marketing Officer at Ulio Technologies, as you can see. He's worked with some of Canada's largest brands, and his contribution to innovation has already been recognised in some awards. He worked for one of the most innovative companies in health in Canada and was actually named as Marketing Magazine's one of the top under 30 marketeers. So that really is an achievement. So thank you, Tyler. Really looking forward to your take on innovation today.
Thank you, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to dive right in. I'm really excited to talk about innovation today. And before we do dive into this idea of innovation, I want to talk a little bit about the Institute of Leadership and Management, and how they identify 5 separate dimensions of great leadership, namely authenticity, vision, achievement, ownership, and collaboration. Now, in total, there are going to be 49 webinars focusing on one of the components of each dimension, highlighting essential learning to assist your leadership development. The second dimension is vision, and that's where we're going to be largely focused on today. Visionary leaders are forward-looking and can help to spot and create opportunities for their organizations. They understand the process of change and can inspire others to co-create the future. And that's really key here, the process of change. It is a process. Right? Innovation isn't about one person with a light bulb moment. Innovation is about building an environment supported through a process, supported through operations, that consistently encourages the co-creation of a new future, driving towards innovation for the organization. And so that is what today's webinar will explore. We're going to be focused on innovation and how to lead innovation within an organization. Again, I think there's this misconception that innovation is a light bulb moment, and certainly there's examples through history of that. But the part that is often ignored as part of these stories, these stories of great innovation, is the culture that was in place, the processes that were in place. So when we talk about leading innovation, that's really what it's about, is making sure that as leaders, we've built out environments where innovation is actually possible. And so, as a leader in your organization, it's absolutely critical that we all look towards implementing these processes and frameworks to help ourselves recognize and nurture innovation when it's present. And that's whether it's technological or not, right? The other misconception I think that happens with innovation is all technology focused, right? Great improvements, great innovation around technology. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes great innovation is simply innovation around an internal business process, right? So innovation doesn't necessarily need to be this big thing. It's something that, as we'll see throughout the webinar, potentially something that's maybe a little bit smaller, but has strong incremental change within our organizations. So let's define innovation, right? What does that mean when we say innovation? And I love the definition that we have here, which is innovation is the practical application of creativity in an organization. Now, if you tease that definition apart, there are some really important elements here. The first is that it's practical. Right? Big ideas are great, but if they can't be practically implemented, then they're of little value to our organizations. The other is creativity. Without focused and structured creativity, we can find ourselves in a chaotic situation where that creativity isn't being focused, it's not being driven in a productive way, and perhaps that creativity isn't being funneled in a way that will drive value for the organization. Now, the other elements around creativity that often pop up is that as humans, we often feel as though we're not creative. right? We kind of separate ourselves between, people that are creative and people that are not creative. As leaders, we might feel that we're not creative, or we might hear, oh, I'm not that creative from members of our teams. Realistically, every human is creative. We're born with creativity built in. The advantage of building out processes, if done right, is we'll discover that all people intrinsically still have that creativity in them. It's just about pulling it out, right? It's about teasing it out and making sure that they have an environment where they feel safe to be creative, right? That's our jobs as leaders within an organization. Now, as we look at innovation, there's really two types of innovation that we can think through. The first is incremental innovation. And this is about making improvements on something that already exists, right? Whether that's a product, service, or like I said earlier, even a process. The second is radical innovation, and this is an entirely new way of doing something. One of the examples I like to use is going way back is ice harvesting, right? Ice harvesting was a booming industry before we had refrigeration. And thousands of years this took place, and there was always incremental innovation around how to cut the ice, how to use better tools, sharper tools, how to transport the ice faster. But at the end of the day, ice harvesting was people going outside, cutting and transporting blocks of ice. Right? It seems pretty antiquated today. And then there was this radical innovation around refrigeration. It completely changed how we stored food, and put these ice harvesting companies out of business. Right? So to me, that's a fairly straightforward example of incremental versus radical. And so, as we look at innovation and actually investing into it, both our time and resources, typically there's four reasons why we might make that investment. The first is to survive or expand in a changing competitive world, which I think is true for many of us. It could be to better manage customer expectations. It could be to manage our resources better, or it could be to just drive the entire sector to innovate further. Right? So usually the reason we're investing in innovation might fall into one of those four buckets. Now, as I've mentioned and as I've talked about as a leader, it's our role to foster this environment where innovative thinking can happen. And to help with this, we can look towards the innovation cycle, which is, I think, a fairly neat way of thinking about all this. First, as a leader, we need to allow for a divergent type of thinking. I think of this as green light brainstorming. We're encouraging our teams to come up with a huge volume of ideas when they're tackling a problem. There's no bad ideas here. Just get it out on the table. And there's a number of ways you can go about this. You can have people do it silently and then present. You can have people do it silently and then submit. You can do it as a group with a bunch of Post-its. I'll leave that part up to you based on your culture. But once you come up with that list of ideas, then you go through and you start to sort those ideas. And this is where you get to judge them, right? This is where, we do say, at first, no real bad ideas. But now that we're starting to judge them, now we can start to elevate the ones that are maybe a little bit more practical and categorize them. Then we move into a convergence phase, right? And this is where you use the criteria that you just came up with, that your team agreed to evaluate some of the ideas. The example that I tend to use is one of shopping carts. If I'm a grocery store and I have a project where I want to innovate around shopping carts, I want that to be a point of joy and excitement when somebody comes into a store. One of the parameters I might put in place is no matter what we do in designing a new shopping cart, we need to make sure that they can still interlock, they can still stack, right? That's one of the practical parameters we need to put in place. Otherwise, if they can't interlock and stack, we don't have enough space to save all of these shopping carts. And so that would be an example of criteria that allows us to converge and shrink down around our ideas. And then, we certainly move into implementation mode, right, where we actually start to take some action. Now, like anything, before you jump into a project, and in this case, before you jump into a large innovation project, you should ask some questions, right? You should ask these of yourself, of your team, to make sure that what you're doing is warranted and worth the investment you're about to put in. And for me, I'll only touch on a couple that are on this slide. In particular, feasibility is an important question to ask, right? The shopping cart example is one of those, right? Having carts that don't interlock isn't feasible, right? Simply because there isn't enough space. And so we need to make sure that in practice, whatever our ideas become and what they evolve into are still practical. Right? And that doesn't mean we can't stretch what the line of practicality is. Right? Sometimes it's going to be about pushing that envelope, but we do need to be honest about what's realistic. And then the other one on here that's really key for me is the stakeholders, right? Who are they? I would suggest as part of any innovation project is you actually map out who all of the key stakeholders are within an organization, and then also external to the organization, right? Who are the key stakeholders outside of the four walls that you work in, right? Understanding who's involved, who will be impacted, and thinking through how to mitigate any challenges with key stakeholders. All of this is a really, really important step to making sure that your project is successful. Right? One of the most common reasons innovation projects fail is because of a lack of stakeholder buy-in. Right? So if you can be proactive and engage stakeholders, make them part of the process, you're much more likely to see success downstream. Which kind of leads into this idea of managing innovation, right? Stakeholder management is a piece, but really overall management and execution is where most projects end up failing, right? As leaders, we probably see this all the time. I've been in a number of instances where innovation projects, as I tend to call them, fall short, right? It gets 95% of the way there, but that 5% over the finish line doesn't really happen. This comes down to management. This comes down to the process, potentially having a dedicated individual or project manager focused on accountability or being accountable to the delivery of key pieces of the project. One of the ways to help manage through an innovation project is to think through, well, what type of innovator am I going to be? Who am I going to be? What role am I going to play? How are we going to innovate? And there's sort of four different ways we can think about this. The first is being a pioneer. Pioneers see market gaps, they see changes in the market, and they very much follow up on that opportunity that they identify and try to exploit it. They want to be the first into market. They want to be driving new product, new service. Usually they'll do this at a higher price point, usually a higher profit margin. I would think of Apple when they first launched their iPad, right? Very, very innovative, not something that people thought they really needed, sold it at a very high price point, high profit margin. The other type of innovator you could be is what's oftentimes referred to as the second in, right? This is where you observe the pioneers, learn from their errors, and then you launch an improved version of that. So you might not be first to market, but when you come to market, you're the best. And I would actually use Apple as an example here again, right? You go back 10, 11 years and Apple was an innovator around the iPhone. Now what you see with Apple is they've very much taken the second in stance, right? We're going to wait for somebody else to come up with facial recognition. We're going to wait for somebody else to come up with mobile payment. We're going to wait for somebody else to come up with wireless charging. Right? And then as they see how the market reacts and what some of the shortfalls are, they perfect it and come to market with what, at least they believe is a better product. And then the third is an imitator, right? This is where you simply copy other people's innovation. Usually you come to market with a lower price variation. And really what you're offering is a lot of value at a lower cost. Right. And I would look at, some of these independent phone manufacturers that are starting to come to market that more or less have the same specs as, let's say, a Samsung or an iPhone, but at a much, much lower cost because you're not necessarily paying for the brand. And then lastly would be taking a defensive stance, right? And usually these are companies that are in more conservative markets. They operate in areas of slow change. Um, and I think of banking in particular, especially in North America, right? Banking and financial institutions have been very, very, very slow to evolve, very slow to adopt digital technology, as an example. But now they're being forced to change, right? Now they can't ignore it anymore. And so you see some of them taking a very, very strong defensive stance, in the vein of you're always going to need a bank teller, and then some, moving very much towards app-enabled banking for a younger generation. So sort of interesting to see. And I think most of you listening can probably plot yourselves and your companies in one of these four areas. Now, to help increase the likelihood of success, your organization, your teams will need to have a certain set of skills and capabilities that you focus on building out. And in my experience, the most critical are the ability to carry out action and deliver on a solution, which I've sort of alluded to. And this truly is all about execution. You just got to start focusing on getting things done. Ideas are great, but ideas brought to life by execution are better, and that's what actually drives value for organizations. Because innovation is typically viewed as a long-term strategy, a lot of organizations let innovation-based projects go on and on and on without any real discernible deadline to get into market. So we need to be a little bit more disciplined around that. And then secondary to execution is the ability to develop a culture of innovation, as I mentioned before. And that's really where you embed certain structures and processes to cultivate that environment. And so one of those processes and one of those elements of culture that becomes really important is a focus on continual improvement. Right? Continuous improvement is an ongoing effort through many, many small incremental steps rather than one overwhelming innovation. Oftentimes you'll hear of this be referred to as the Kaizen methodology. Very, very small incremental change, and over time that's meant to be a big change. Right? The aggregate is much bigger than the individual pieces. And really these incremental changes that add up to major improvement, that takes long-term practice, it takes discipline, and a lot of organizations are starting to set up continuous improvement teams that are given considerable authority and empowerment to make sure that this is being driven home in their organizations, right? So something else to think about that. This is actually a dedicated discipline, a dedicated role within a team or a company. And one of the tools that I'd like to share is called the Deming cycle, and this is a widely used 4-stage tool, and it can help you start to embed this idea of continuous improvement. And the first is identifying some kind of opportunity, mapping out some sort of plan for change. And then you move into the do part, right? That's where you implement that change, but you do it on a small scale, right? So it's not about a wide scale rollout. This is about implementing that idea on a small scale, test it, and then we move into the check piece, right? And that's really the measurement piece. That's where we analyze the results of that small test. Before we do this, we should think through what kind of data we might use to evaluate success or failure. How did this test make a difference? Really, we're talking about validating the idea. And then we move towards act, right? So if it was successful based on our criteria, then move towards implementing it on a wider scale, then monitor it closely and continually improve. If we didn't validate the idea, if there wasn't data to suggest that this was a good improvement, then you kind of go back to the plan, what's the next idea, and move on from there. Right? And then the cycle continues. And then lastly, before we open it up for questions, also just wanted to touch on this. This comes from the Lean Enterprise Institute. And this is where they describe a continuous 5-step thought process for implementing lean techniques. They begin with specifying value from the standpoint of the end customer, which is really, really key, right? Value from the perspective of your clients and your customers, right? That means you got to talk to them. You need to understand where they see value. And sometimes you'll see that there's a disconnect between what your customers think the value is and what you think the value was that you were providing. So really important that you dig into that. And then they move right through to a state of perfection, right? And that state of perfection is really only ever reached when perfect value is created and there's really no waste within that value chain. And then that process is repeated, right? And this is their notion of continual improvement. So really interesting. It's something that I would suggest that you dig into a little bit more. I like this quite a bit because it forces you to look at value from the perspective of your clients and customers. Step 2 is about mapping that entire value stream, and you can do this for every product within your offering. And then wherever possible, what you want to do is eliminate any of the steps within that value stream that don't create value. Oftentimes there's wasted time, wasted effort in steps that aren't actually driving value for the customer. Right, and then you move into step 3, this idea of creating flow. And really that's about making the value creating steps occur in very tight sequences, so that the product will flow very smoothly towards the customer, right? You want to remove any sort of friction from that client experience value. And then as that flow and that value is introduced, let customers continue to pull value from whatever the next upstream activity might be. And then, like I said, you move towards this idea of perfection. Right? So as the value is specified, you've identified all of the elements in that value stream, you've removed wasteful steps, then you can start to move towards continuous improvement where you try to perfect that process. So that's what I have for today. The one thing I'll just call out, there's a number of resources that were referenced throughout. I'm always a huge fan of digging into some of these resources to go as deep as I'd like. So I'd suggest that you do the same. Check some of these out. In particular, Mapping Innovation, I think, is a really, really strong tool because it really dives into this idea of how do we map this out and create a playbook for innovation. So thank you. Really happy to open it up.
Thank you, Luke. Sorry, thank you, Tyler. Really enjoyed that. And we have had some questions coming in. The first one that we've got is, in your opinion, what are the common mistakes that block innovation in organizations?
Yeah, really good question. So, and I know I probably beat this to death as I was speaking, but it really is process, right? I think a lot of people, like I said, assume innovation is a genius person left alone to be creative. And certainly that might happen, but it's not predictable. It's not sustainable. And so the biggest obstacle is not having that process. And it's process everything around how are we coming up with ideas? How are we judging and evaluating ideas? How are we going to test and experiment and validate these ideas? To use a really, really simple example, if you check out and you haven't come across it, Google Venture has a 5-day sprint. Not ideal from long-term innovation thinking. There's holes in it, but a really good example of how you might structure an innovation project over 5 days, right? And what I would do is look at that and say, oh, wow, if I just follow this playbook, there's a good chance that at the end of 5 days, I'm going to have something that I can start to implement on. Right? So for me, the biggest obstacle is just lack of structure and process.
Right, thanks very much. We've got another question about, in your experience, are there some industries that don't need to innovate or die, or is that the case for all of us?
I think at some point that's going to be the case for all of us, right? There's certain industries that are going to be slower to change, right? If you think of, I'll use the example of banking and financial institutions, right? They're so big, they're so ingrained in the economy. They're right now they're not in a position of innovate or die. In 15 years, though, 20 years, they probably will be, right? As the next generation comes up and they don't go into physical locations, they're used to fulfilling all of their needs through an app. They don't necessarily have trust in employees of a company, right? They want to make decisions on their own, right? That's going to be a disruptive shift in the market for banking. So I truly do believe that at some point every organization is going to face it. It's about trying to have the foresight to say, okay, this is when it's going to hit us, right? And maybe that horizon is 15 years out, but we should start thinking about it and planning for it. Right, and this goes back to just a book to recommend, which is a classic, Innovator's Dilemma. Sort of talks about this, right? You know, if you're already in an industry that isn't in that space of needing to innovate or die, how do you still mitigate the fact that you might be out innovated when you're sort of the top player in a market?
Thanks very much. And we have another question. Have you an example of an accidental innovation? I think you've done really well about telling us about how you embed innovation and you take it seriously and you evaluate, and you gave us the Google model. But how about when it happens by accident? What's your response there?
That's a great question. I think you know, if you look at 3M as an example, they have a ton of examples of accidental innovation, right? They're developing something for NASA, and then all of a sudden that becomes Velcro, right? That type of thing. You know, in my personal experience, Ulio Technologies was never meant to be a VR application for architects and interior designers, right? Originally, it was meant to be a way to better visualize, not even necessarily in VR, better visualize commercial furniture design, right? And accidentally, we started to stumble into, oh wow, we could easily pivot this into VR. And it doesn't need to be this, you know, huge, massive investment into a dedicated VR play. We kind of stumbled into it and then built a whole company around it. So there's certainly examples of it. What I would say, though, is when you dig into that, the innovation itself isn't accidental, right? There's still a tremendous amount of process that typically has happened. Even if it's not documented, right? But there's steps that somebody has taken that led them to a product innovation, a service innovation. The accident is sort of realizing that they try to apply it to the wrong market, and you know, success comes from pivoting into another market. So even with these stories of accidental innovation, I would still suggest in the background there's a certain series of steps that likely happen to get them there.
Thanks very much for that answer. So it's never an accident. We just didn't know that we were actually engaged with doing it, which is a good answer. Our final question is, we always like a top tip at the end of our webinars. So if I was to say, Tyler, how can I be more innovative tomorrow? What would your top tip be?
So I would say keeping a notebook or keeping a file, something on your computer. I use Evernote, and what I do is I'm constantly just dropping in things I've come across, ideas I've had, you know, areas of inspiration. Almost like if you've ever talked to a copywriter or a journalist, usually they have a file of all of the great copy they've ever come across, and they use that for inspiration. I do the same thing around innovation and ideas. Is keep this docket, and anytime I'm going into a project that requires innovation, I refer back to it, and it's a way to spark creativity, spark ideas. It gives you a starting point, a jumping off point. And because that's where I find a lot of people struggle, right? A lot of people struggle when they move into this idea of innovation is the ideas they come up with, quite frankly, if they come up with 10 ideas, somebody else could come up with the exact same 8 or 9, right? There's very little uniqueness that comes from it. And so I find having this docket of ideas and inspiration helps trigger you to think outside of maybe what your norm is, think outside of the box a little bit. So that's my tip. It's very simple, but I like simple because simple is easy to implement and manage.
Well, thanks very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time now, but really enjoyed that. And it's over to Juliet for final instructions. And thank you once again for everybody who's joined us.